concern you most?
Thank you, Martin. And I'm going to give you the conventional wisdom answer that is prescribed by the IMF, and then I'll tell you what I really feel about.
Okay. Get through the first part quickly. We know that.
Now, in terms of risks, and we have seen some of those risks that we identified during the spring materialize, particularly in relation to trade. But those risks are, number one, consequences of legitimate and necessary monetary tightening and how it impacts emerging market economies, low-income and developing countries, particularly given that many of them have actually taken advantage of low financing costs to borrow in often dollar-denominated loans. That's number one. Number two, geopolitical risks or crises that abound, but that's not a new development. We always have geopolitical development. At the moment, they certainly are there. And the third one, which is related to trade, is one that is really a big question mark, because it is a disruption from a system that has been in place for a long time, which was multilateral, which brought people together, which has its downside, its defects, which needs resetting in many ways, which needs more flexibility as well. But the level of uncertainty combined with the first point that I made is really a new environment in which emerging markets in particular have to really respond using all the tools in their box. Now, if I give you my personal worry, it's only a fear. It's not something that is happening. But I really hope that we are not all victim of this sort of collective amnesia about what happened 10 years ago or what happened way before that, when protectionism was rising and where geopolitical tensions combined with that rise of protectionism produced terrible developments. Amnesia plus fear about the future, which leads us to not really focusing on major issues such as climate change and its impact, such as the risk that excessive inequality can bring to bear not only on growth, as we have demonstrated, but on the strength and composition and chemistry of our societies. So that's some sort of an accelerated Alzheimer that we would be the victim of.
When you were referring to previous periods when protectionism got out of hand, were you actually talking then about the pre-war period? Or,
yes.
Yes. I mean, the crucial point, of course, was that it was against that backdrop that the Bretton Woods Conference was created. The decision to create a trade organization really went along with it. So are you suggesting in some profound way that there are challenges to the entire global system of cooperation, of which the IMF is a representative and a symbol?
I think that the IMF at the moment is not on the radar screen, if you will. But the IMF was certainly one of those institutions that were built at the time in 1944 to really develop multilateralism with a view to avoiding those conflicts and those terrible destructions that we saw during the Second World War. I think the way it was structured by the Founding Fathers, with weighted voting mechanisms, with a formula evolution that was embedded in the articles, has made our institution, the IMF, stronger than others. And, you know, we discussed the situation of the WTO, which was also an evolution of the GATT decided in 1944. There is rigidity in the functioning of the WTO, which clearly can lead to it being more crippled than an institution that has flexibility, that has evolution as part of its own system. And I think that's where we should really focus the effort.
Let me just ask one follow-up question, which is a difficult one, but I think is sort of cannot be avoided in this context. It is obvious to anybody here that some really quite profound tensions of various kinds are emerging between the US and China. These are two enormous players, the incumbent superpower, if you like, and the ascendant one. Is it possible, in your view, for a really important multilateral institution like the fund, the WTO is another example, you were moderating a panel on that, to function properly in an environment in which there is so much tension between two such immensely important players in the system?
I guess it would be a difficult exercise, but I hope not an impossible one, particularly if we can constitute that forum where parties that do not agree are prepared to look honestly at the issues and appreciate the consequences of the tensions that are being created. So I very much hope that the IMF can participate in that exercise and be that forum where people actually talk and explore avenues to resolve the tensions that have escalated.
So one of the ideas, but this is more relevant to the WTO context, and I'll move on to you, is a sort of, if you like, if I may use the phrase, a coalition of the willing. The people who want to proceed forward, even if it does include everybody, and this is clearly what's happening in climate too, which you mentioned, would proceed, and maybe the US at the moment would not want to participate, but might change its mind in future. Do you think this is something that essentially we in the world will have to think about seriously across quite a range of things? Trade, climate, maybe other areas, monetary cooperation?
I think if you look at the TPP, for instance, this is clearly the route
Interesting example.
has been taken for plurilateral agreement that was intended for 12 and that is eventually settled for 11. Might be a 12th one if the UK decided to join, but that's another story. You know, in terms of international monetary order, I don't see how that order could continue to operate, be governed and organized without the reserve currency of the world, and that is the US dollar. So I think that we should make every effort to include all the players at the table and find avenues to reach settlement on those debated issues.
And certainly there's nothing we've seen in the last decade, rather the contrary, to suggest that the dollar's position will be dethroned in the near future or even in the longer term future.
I think you're right, and I don't see any currency that is at the moment willing to go in that direction and to assume the liabilities and responsibilities that go with it. No.
And it won't be the SDR either. Let me move on to where we started. You mentioned quite a number of concerns, the vulnerability of emerging economies that have taken on a lot of dollar debt in various forms, and we're so familiar with the effects of a stronger dollar and rising currency and rising interest rates. We have the trade issue, very big one, weaknesses in the global financial system, huge amounts of debt out there, and of course we have more recent ones, the oil price rise, very significant. But if you look at some of these things, the global financial system, the vulnerability of emerging economies and so forth, how much would you attribute this to errors made of commission or omission by key policy makers and advisors, including the IMF itself? Have you warned, for example, something that concerns me a lot, have you warned emerging economies, in your view, enough of the dangers of recreating the sort of balance sheet vulnerabilities we saw in the 90s? Do you feel happy with what you've been doing, in other words?
Well, I'm never happy because we can always do better. But when I look at the alert that we launched about a year ago now, actually before that, because I remember that conference that we gave in Mozambique, and it was initially going to be Africa Rising. And I remember discussing that with the African department and saying, you know, is it just Africa Rising, or should not be as well Africa Watching? And we did actually change that conference to Africa Rising, Africa Watching, meaning watch out, because you are currently courted by all those investors and all those financial people who want yields out of those bonds that they're going to place for you. And if you do that in another currency than yours, it's going to expose you to significant movements going forward. So we did that, and about a year ago we also raised the alarm and said, watch out, debt is up. The $160 billion figure that we mentioned about a year ago was mentioned by the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. So I think on the debt front, we've been quite vocal about the rising risks that came from that facility, and it was a facility. Still is for some countries, by the way.
One of the really big dilemmas that US advisors have faced is thinking about the monetary policies of developed countries. Mm-hmm. So you have taken the view, have agreed with it, so claim that it was right and proper to pursue these extremely expansionary, including unconventional monetary policies to secure a recovery. Of course, many in emerging markets, some of them very distinguished, for instance, Raghuram Rajan, when he was governor of the Reserve Bank, argued that this was profoundly dangerous for the emerging world and that it would lead to exactly what we are now seeing. Do you feel completely sure now, looking at the advice you gave and the consequences, you look at all the emerging countries under pressure now, that you gave the right advice?
Well, we have to look at the counterfactual. What would have happened had it not been for those accommodative monetary policies? And what kind of financial and economic crisis would have the world faced had that not happened? And I think that the answer, probably, it's difficult with counterfactuals, but the answer would have been a lot worse, and a lot worse for emerging market economies and for low-income and developing countries as well. So yes, it is not ideal, and the volume of, the size of the balance sheet of many of the large central banks is an issue that needs to be addressed, and the way in which those instruments will come to maturity will be, sort of resolved by a variety of mechanisms, I suppose, is a critical issue on the one hand. On the other hand, the emerging market economies and the low-income and developing countries are going to have to use all the tools in their toolbox to resist the consequences of what inevitably will happen, which is this outflow of capitals that came to the emerging and low-income countries sometimes in search for yield.
Should the IMF be arguing far more strongly than it is in favor of really tight inflow capital controls in emerging economies?
That's a
question. And I mean, the authorities of some very important countries, China and India, for example, clearly believe they have been helped by being able to regulate quite closely, with varying degrees of success, the inflow, and then of course it makes it easier to manage the outflow of capital. And the vulnerability of the Latin American region, for example, reflects their relatively somewhat more laissez-faire stance. Should you be, I know you've, over the last 20 years, since the Asian financial crisis, the fund has been going there, but it's still very cautious. Should you be much stronger and say, this is actually poison?
It's the whole debate about the capital flow management measures. Yeah. And are they legitimate to support the overall system? And if so, when and at what point? And I think the institutional view that we have reached back in 2012 and which has recently been confirmed in 2016 when we put it back to the international community was that capital flow management measures